is someone that is praised for their interesting art, whether it's the beautiful intricate sky of Starry Night or the gritty aesthetic of the Potato Eaters. He seriously could not come up with any better name for that. Gough was a very famous artist. If you ask anybody who has a basic understanding of the culture, then they would most likely already know about him. So how did he come to be the super famous individual? Well, let me tell you the story of Vincent Van Gogh. Vincent was born March 30th, 1853 in the Netherlands. His parents were these people, who each had their own jobs. Luckily, the birth of the artist went smoothly and was followed up by 2 new sisters and 3 brothers. The most important one was Theo, who will become important later. When Van Gogh was 11, he moved from a small village school to a boarding school in Zevenbergen, and just like regular schools for all of us, he hated it. He was deeply unhappy there, and probably wanted to go home and throw rocks at trees or something. 2 years later, Vincent was taught at a school in Tilburg, where he earned good grades and was generally a good student altogether, until he quit halfway through the school year and never came back afterwards. When Vincent was 16, he was hooked up to a job as an art dealer by his uncle. His brother Theo would later join. In 1873, he was transferred to London, and then 2 years later, he was transferred to Paris, where he lost all ambition of being an art dealer. Instead, he praised religion, and in 1876 was dismissed from his job. Before getting fired from his job, Gough decided to send a letter to his brother Theo. It's a pretty long letter, and it contains a lot of very confusing poetry, so instead I'll summarize it. He was basically talking about how the landscape was nice, how he missed his house, he was working a 9-to-5 job, he was a loser, was lonely, had no friends there, and that's kind of it. After being fired from his job, Vincent went back to England, where he was an unpaid teacher's assistant in a boys' boarding school. Later, he found a better job position in a place run by a vicar, which is a member of the clergy. However, they don't have as much power, so they're basically just holy members. He was able to preach his wisdom there, though, which is a pretty cool deal. It offered very few opportunities, however, and when he was spending Christmas time with his family, his father told him to not go back to England. Like any good father should. But, he obliged, of course, and decided not to return to England next year. To be honest, the father was probably done dealing with his crap, because that makes more sense. In 1877, he got a new job as a bookkeeper from, again, his uncle. However, his parents were becoming increasingly worried that he was becoming more religious, like the good parents that they are. Well, this was because he was 24 at this time and literally had no clear purpose in life, other than just existing and taking money out of their bank accounts. Well, afterward, he decided to study theology, but because he decided it would be a good idea to drop out of school halfway, he had to take the entrance exam again. What an idiot. Vincent was currently living in Amsterdam, and an uncle was helping him prepare for his entrance exam to theology. However, he lacked the bare minimum discipline to even study, so they basically just gave up on teaching him. Vincent used to send little sketches of the letters that he sent to Theo. If you take a look at them for more than 5 seconds, you can tell they have great shading and depth. Theo told him to concentrate more on his art, so Vincent listened and decided to move to Brussels in 1880. However, he had no job, so the Theo decided to send him money every now and then in the form of a paycheck. What a great dude. After being inspired by Theo, he went on a grand adventure that was basically like the 13 Trials of Odysseus. He went to Drenthe, moved back in with his parents, and most importantly, had an affair. But all of the stories are way too long and would take a while to explain, and because children have very short attention spans, I will just explain the main plot of what happened afterward. Basically, he started work on his first masterpiece, The Potato Eaters, in the back of the studio in his parents' house. This picture is the first masterpiece that Vincent ever created, and it definitely shows off the talents that the man held. The painting was created during the Post-Impressionism era, and has a gritty and dark aesthetic. Vincent used noticeably toned-down colors that cloaked the background in an ominous haze. He painted the people in the photos with wavier facial expressions and having shadows envelop most of their bodies. The lighting is done very well, with the only source being emanated from the center of the image, and only showing on certain parts of the body. This, along with the realistic smoke effects as well as food, contrasts to the whole image looking realistic, but at the same time fantastical. Vincent later left for Antwerp, Belgium after making this painting. It is now in Antwerp, which has cool art supplies, good museums, and galleries. However, he was such a narcissist that he said that all of the art was bad. And this is a verse from one of his letters, and I quote, "I actually find all of the drawings I see there hopelessly bad and fundamentally wrong. And I know that mine are totally different. Time will just have to tell who's right. Damn it, not one of them has any feeling for what a classical statue is." What a narcissist! But anyways, there he painted pictures such as head of a skeleton smoking a cigarette. My personal favorite because it's a head of a skeleton smoking a cigarette. From From 1886 to 1888, a big change happened that would finalize Vincent's style forever. Basically, Theo showed him some of the new paintings of the new art movement that had a lot more color and were generally a lot more lively than the more depressing pictures like the potato eaters that I just talked about. Vincent was inspired by these and began using more lighter variants of his paintings, for example, such as The Path of the Woods, or trees. Just trees. Eventually, he was also inspired by Japanese woodcuts, and you can immediately see their influence throughout his paintings. However, after living in Paris for 2 years, he eventually got sick of it and wanted to move to Japan. However, he couldn't afford a plane ticket because they didn't exist, so he instead settled for Arles on the River Rhone. Gogh was now living in Arles, and he absolutely loved it there. He liked the countryside, the nice views, and he even had a cool idea in mind. Basically, he would make this kind of art colony where he would rent out 4 rooms for famous artists, and they would all just kind of hang out and create art together. It's a cool idea on paper. Sadly, it wasn't executed very well. Paul Gauguin was the first to arrive, and they immediately set to work creating different kinds of art, and even little presents for each other, such as art that they would give to each other, which was very creative, by the way. Sadly, each of them had different views on art, which would lead to very blazing discussions about art. This leads me to my next masterpiece, which was something that Vincent actually painted for Paul. This picture has a special significance for Vincent, as he painted 2 of them, one for himself and one for Paul. He put the former in his room and the latter in Paul's room. The painting itself is comprised almost entirely in shades of yellow, and has wavy, droopy stems that look like the sunflowers move anthropomorphically. This picture has no shading, instead using darker colors to show which petals are behind one another. Overall, it's a picture that has a nice backstory behind it, so it's a win in my book. Now Vincent so far may seem like some stand-up guy, right? He's obviously nice, he helps people, he makes cool art. He does have some arguments sometimes, but that's kind of a small thing. Well, you'd be dead wrong, because his mental health is on a whole nother spectrum. Because this is when the insanity begins. Basically, while having one of those absurdly lazy discussions with Paul Gauguin about, obviously, art, what else would they talk about? He decides that the best course of action to prove that he is right is to pull a razor blade out of his pocket and threaten his friend with it. I am not even kidding. He decides that it's a good idea to almost kill his friend by just casually pulling out a razor blade. Like, he's just, imagine, he's just sitting in a corner, just like waving a razor blade around like it's nothing. And he was so close. He could have just shanked his friend in the middle of that hotel. In like, I don't know, why would he have done that? I don't know why he thought it was a good idea to just pull out a razor blade. And then it gets worse. It somehow gets worse. Basically, after that obvious casual discussion that did not involve almost murder, he goes back to his house. And then, here's the thing, he has something called manic depression, which means that he has frequent and rapid mood shifts, as well as hallucinating and just losing consciousness. During one of those lost consciousness stages, he literally cuts off his own ear, completely clean off, and he just has it in his hand. He takes that same razor blade and just cuts off his right ear. Yeah, right ear, just this ear, he just cuts it off. And then it gets, I don't know why, I guess the logical, thinking decision of his brain just turned off because he wraps it up. He wraps up the ear, walks outside of a brothel, and just gives it to a random prostitute. He just gives it. He just, hands it over to them like it's some sort of Christmas present that you're giving to your parents. You don't just do that, because not a sane person would do that. So that prostitute is definitely traumatized now because they just received a random ear. And here's the thing about that prostitute. Nobody knows if it's a prostitute or if it's a random cleaner lady because people just can't decide. I personally couldn't care less because it's some random person from the 1800s. But why would he give it to anyone, period? And it gets crazier. Basically, after he goes to the hospital because he cut off his ear, and then he self-admits himself to a mental hospital. There, he has another one of those episodes where he eats his own paint. I don't know why he would eat his own paint, but he looks at his paint and just decides that it's a good idea to treat it as if it was a healthy snack and just eat the entire thing. He was basically chucking down tubes of paint. It gets funnier because they basically ban him from painting like he's a toddler or something that you take away his toy from. It's completely insane. Luckily though, he does recover mentally and hopefully physically as well. And he ends up painting a lot more. He actually paints 150 paintings in 1 year, which is completely absurd. Which is basically one painting every 2 days. And they look good. I'm being completely serious. So I guess, is it an upside? No. He lost his ear. So, no, it's not an upside. But overall, I think it was still kind of a daunting experience on his part. Vincent left a mental hospital in 1890 and headed north to Aubers, which offered him the peace and quiet he needed while also being close enough to Paris that he could visit Theo. There was a doctor there too, Paul Gadget, who would keep an eye on him just in case he had any other episodes. Vincent quickly befriended Gadget, who himself was an amateur painter, and he told Go to devote himself completely to his art. He did exactly that, painting the gardens and wheat fields at a fast rate. He completed basically an entire painting a day. This was also the time that he created Starry Night, the third and final painting I will talk about. Starry Night has a couple of aspects that stand out from the crowd: the wavy wind patterns, the almost fire-like tree on the left, and the beautiful stars, all of which were painted in such an exquisite manner that makes modern art look like piss. The pattern that signifies the sky and the stars is so noticeable that it is hard to look away. However, my favorite part is the moon, which is so recognizable that if you showed a lot of people it, they would probably immediately know which painting it is. Vincent was already panicking about financial issues, since Leo was planning on quitting his job to start his own business. That, alongside his mental illness, accounted to the date of July 27, 1890, where he walked into a random wheat field in the middle of Belgium and shot himself on the chest with a 7mm Luftwaffe pinfire revolver. He then casually walked back into his hotel room and laid himself down on the bed and took a nap. There, someone called the hospital, and he was taken there, while Theo rushed to Paris to see what had happened. He was there when his brother sadly died from his injuries. Vincent was buried July 30th, 1890, and left over 850 paintings in his wake, thus ending the tale of this magnificent and poetic artist. Except it wasn't poetic at all, because he killed himself because he was mentally insane. How is that poetic?